Alright, it's Barry, and today on Grow It, I've got my top 5 tomatoes to grow from seed. We're at the start of the tomato growing season, and that means that if you haven't already, it's time to choose the varieties of tomatoes that you want to grow this year. There's a number of factors to take into consideration when you're choosing your tomato seeds, such as whether you want to grow them inside a greenhouse or just outdoors, or you might base your choice on the size of tomato that you'd like. So maybe you'd want cherry tomatoes, salad tomatoes, or beef tomatoes, depending on what you want to use them for. Or even something as simple as the colour, you might want traditional red tomatoes, yellow ones, pattern ones, or even black ones. Well, today I've got my 5 favourite tomato types based on the different characteristics, so let's have a look and get started with number 5. Heirloom tomatoes, which are also sometimes called heritage tomatoes, are open-pollinated, non-hybrid cultivars of tomato. Open-pollinated crops are ones that have been naturally pollinated by insects or birds, and non-hybrid means that they haven't been crossbred with other cultivars to have specific characteristics. They do usually have a shorter shelf life than hybrids, and they can be less disease resistant, so if you do live in an area that's particularly susceptible to blight later in the year, or if you do plan to grow them outside, it might be best to go for a more disease resistant variety. Heirloom variety is a great choice for growing for food, or maybe if you just like to save your own seeds each year, or even if you're just interested in growing some historical varieties to try eating some tomatoes from the past. You'd be surprised how different they are to modern tomatoes. A great heritage tomato to try is Brandywine, which grows large beef tomatoes, which are a cultivar dating back to 1885. Which brings me on to the next variety, beef tomatoes, which are also known as beefsteak tomatoes. Beef tomatoes are one of the largest varieties of tomato, and they're quite popular for growing at home. They're also great for slicing and sticking on sandwiches or burgers, and you don't tend to see them as often in shops, but big supermarkets do usually have them, and you can usually buy them individually rather than in packs. Some popular varieties include Beefmaster, Beefsteak, and Big Beef. I grew a single beef tomato plant last year after I saw it in B&Q for 50p. I think that was a Beefmaster, and I grew some of the best tomatoes that I had last year on that plant. Plum tomatoes are a type of tomato that's been mostly bred for sauces and packaging purposes, and they're usually the kind that you'll get in a can or in a little plastic bag at the shop, and they're usually longer and cylindrical in shape with less seed compartments than what you get in a standard round tomato, which makes them more suitable for processing. The main varieties of plum tomatoes that you usually see in the supermarkets include Roma and San Marzano, and these are also the most popular varieties for growing from seed as well. Cherry tomatoes are small round tomatoes that are in between the smaller wild currant tomatoes and the standard sized garden tomato. They're also usually red, but there's also some varieties with like yellow or green or purple tomatoes, and cherry tomatoes are a popular choice for growing outdoors or in an unheated greenhouse. Last year I grew Gardener's Delight, which is slightly larger than a standard cherry tomato, but I got loads of tomatoes from like 6 plants, and they kept on growing all the way through the summer into autumn. And I also grew Sun Grape, which were darker red and slightly smaller, and they didn't produce as many tomatoes as the Gardener's Delight plants, but the tomato flavour was really intense, and they were probably the most tomatoey tomatoes I've ever tasted. And finally, we've got my favourite type of tomatoes, which is a classic greenhouse variety called Moneymaker. I used Moneymaker plants for my tomato feeding experiment last year, and all of the fruit were fantastic from all of the plants. The tomatoes are round and smooth, and they're usually the variety that you'd find in like a net at a supermarket or labelled as solid tomatoes. Tomatoes are best grown in greenhouses in cooler climates, and cultivars such as Moneymaker are specifically bred for indoor growing. I'm growing Moneymakers for my main variety in this greenhouse this year, and I'll be testing a range of plant foods to see which ones are the best for growing loads of tomatoes. That video is a few weeks away yet though, when it's time to start feeding the plants, but I'll be sowing all of my other tomatoes next week with a guide with everything you need to know to grow your own tomatoes from seeds. So if you haven't already, why don't you press the subscribe button to make sure that you catch that guide and all of my other gardening videos coming up every week through the spring. So let me know in the comments which tomato varieties you're growing this year, or if you've got a favourite variety that I didn't mention today, and I'll see you next time.